Hello, you're listening to the Futurist New Deal podcast, featuring Johan Ben Zion and our special guest, Stace NG. And we're talking about citizen science. And basically, we were talking about this before, what kinds of things we might do if we had multi-million-dollar science labs and we're really interested in some sort of agitprop or really pushing the envelope, maybe in ways that would be of interest to society, but in ways that are regarded as beyond the accepted bounds of scientific experimentation. Not things that are completely insane, like dangerous things, but just stopping short of that, for the most part, I would think. So we had made a list of these things, different kinds of things that are possible now or might be possible relatively soon, and we wanted to talk about them. We might have to look up a term here too, but I don't think we will. Let's see. One of the first things on the list is something that's been in the news a little bit over the last 2 years, not to the extent of the Chinese CRISPR babies, but one that I think would be of interest to people in the United States, particularly who are socially conservative on this particular issue, which is the prospect of an artificial uterus. What is your impression of biobags or artificial womb technology for humans, Stace?
Well, I think it would actually be an alternative to abortions, and I think perhaps it could be a solution for infertility and transgender, and probably maybe even address, I don't know, something like miscarriages.
So opening up a lot of fertility medicine applications for people, different backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's my impression as well. And I want to say, I said this exact same thing in the last podcast. All the parties here are pro-choice, and the Futurist New Deal is a pro-choice platform. We don't talk about it a lot, but we are at no point going to be talking about criminalizing ordinary behavior of not having a child or anything along those lines. But what we would be talking about is maybe advancing fertility medicine to such a point where some of these things might not even be something that we talk about anymore. I'm convinced that could have been a possibility in the United States some decades ago, had we had just a little bit more a science-oriented society, rather than have a society that's organized around scientism. We have a society that's seems to be as much organized around anti-science sentiments and know-nothing sentiments, things that I don't particularly like, and I don't think they serve techno-progressive ends in any way. And biobags is an interesting take on all of that, because it's in some ways as controversial as anything in fertility medicine today. You can see social conservatives who would maybe otherwise want to use something like this to force women to have a child that they don't want to have, effectively, to prevent the terminations of pregnancies. You might see them also being so unnerved by such a thing that they wouldn't want to do it, because it's a great departure from ideas of the nuclear family and so forth.
Well, it's also pretty challenging or difficult on a woman's body to carry a child anyway, so it might be quite a bit easier for biobags, women who don't want to wreck their body.
That's true. It might be a public health argument in and of itself, a sort of Freakonomics public health argument, in the way that I say people should use bidets to prevent diverticulitis. No, there's any number of things that people could be doing we could be doing as a society in terms of hygiene that might, in total, be preventing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of costs to healthcare systems. The most obvious ones, like not eating sugar, that's a big money pit for healthcare. But some of the other ones are kind of freakonomics things, I guess. I'm gonna keep saying that awesome word, like using more ergonomic toilets, a bunch of things like that. But it's probably better to talk about the ones that are a little higher on the list, maybe like sugar. But I digress. What do you? I've heard projections that say that biobags for humans could be being field tested in 18 months or 2 years, something like that. What are your impressions of the technology? Do you have any other things that we would want to discuss about this besides the politics of it?
I don't really have any insight into like the production of biobags, but I imagine if the funding were there, they would have the ability to produce something like that within a couple years.
Yeah, and it's a search term. I've looked through any number of articles on the subject of the biobags that were created for other mammals, these little lammy poos, and what the implications are for humans, and it's something that's not too far off, and it's pretty amazing. And I was talking to some transhumanists from different parts of North America recently, and getting an idea of the sensitivities of people in different parts of North America who are techno-optimists, and I can't help but feel that this kind of technology would be something that could be potentially funded by conservative organizations who don't have these misgivings necessarily about this nuclear family type concerns. You can't imagine like Focus on the Family maybe funding this, as much as they are quote unquote pro-life. They're also very pro paleo-conservative social values, and you can't imagine. I can't imagine a lot of organizations, but I know there are some. Just as we can say that there are some organizations that are funded by the Koch influence operation, which are more progressive or more genuinely libertarian than others, and potentially even some organizations of those kind might very well fund research into something like this. The idea of state-run biobags, this being something that's offered by these kinds of places that are alternatives to Planned Parenthood, these conservative fertility centers, that many of which are not fertility centers at all, they're just propagandists. But you can imagine these people getting the resources and putting something like this together, this kind of program. And I mean, that's an interesting thing. If money is no object, I suppose there's some things that would tend to recommend it. It's an evil genius kind of idea, and this subject of citizen science and evil genius kind of ideas. Not my idea, not calling myself a genius. Talking about CRISPR babies, I think that's a reasonable segue from the list. What do you want to say about what you've read about CRISPR babies, your feelings? I think people know, I've said this a few times anyway, in other forums, that I agree with George Church on this subject, and I've had this opinion before I read what George Church thought on the subject, but I think he sums it up pretty well. There's cases to be made for going full speed ahead with this kind of research, being very, very circumspect as you go, but not. I think that most of this anti-CRISPR baby sentiments are born out of this kind of self-preservation on the part of the scientific community, or a kind of overpowering desire not to be associated with mad scientists, irrespective of whether the mad scientists actually cure AIDS or something. What do you think, Stacey?
Well, recently it was something speculated in the news where they were talking about how the gene that they had manipulated in order to prevent HIV actually reduced the life expectancy of these 2 Chinese babies.
Yes, and these pregnancies were not terminated at this point.
As far as I understand.
So these are living human beings now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, they were definitely not terminated. The question was if there was any other information about how they're doing. But yeah, they were definitely not terminated. These are live human beings now. And it's true. They have altered DNA, which is maybe not optimal DNA. It could be causing problems for them.
Yeah. Anytime we do gene manipulation at this point, we really have no understanding of how one particular set of genes could affect multiple different other pathways and downstream or upstream of what's been manipulated. So it's one of those areas where I'd say we definitely need to tread carefully, but
the understanding is improved.
It has been improved.
I mean, when
we don't understand genes well, our genome well enough to understand how one alteration can affect multiple others.
And I think most every techno-optimist holds at this moment in their mind when Craig Ventnor mapped the human genome project, which was expected by many before that time to take quite a bit longer. But at that time, it was not as if having mapped the human genome, there was some extremely high understanding of those interrelationships.
That's true.
But it's improved a little bit.
Well, the understanding then, I think, was that one gene produced one protein. Now I think what we're seeing is one gene can
Interaction
cause
effects,
multiple different proteins or multiple different expressions. So we don't really have a clear understanding of how that works. So definitely I would say we need to tread carefully, and I don't think human experimentation is the way to go forward yet, but that it's something that we can see in the very near future.
Yeah, and this is something that, I made mention of this to you immediately before this talk, that I tend to have a view of things maybe from a little bit of a tech journalist perspective, but also from a sort of wishful thinking perspective to some degree, thinking about the metaverse and the world of 10 or 20 years, which is getting into territory where you're not necessarily talking about biomedical realities, but rather talking about speculative and science fiction concepts, which is in contrast to your more earthbound and reality-based profession and your work in your profession. A few moments before this podcast, we had kind of a minor little disagreement about the prospect or timeline of being able to model a series of deletions or additions to the genome more robustly and understand what its consequences would be. And you said that such a thing was far-fetched, and I said that we don't know what the state of computer science of 10 years might be to say that such a thing was so far-fetched. I remember having a conversation with a scientist friend in 2002 where I suggested something along the lines of CRISPR modifications that are happening now, and this person, a high-functioning professional, said that she thought that something like this was 50 years away, and it turned out to be 12 years away. And I think that changes in computer science, people in this community talk about Moore's law, an accelerating rate of returns in technological and computing power, rather. And I think that is still in play. Other exponential growth outcomes of this kind are in play, even if Moore's law has not been truly demonstrated. It's slowed down at times. It's been a little unreliable at times, but it's still pretty big growth curve. So yeah, I mean, I would like to see the creation of theoretical creatures. You know, maybe I think people. This is definitely getting into something we don't want to spend too much time on. But if you're able to model, yeah, synthetic biology is a reality now. But we could see it in terms of maybe more of the sort of Michael Crichton amusement park kind of reality than just multicellular organisms or small micro.
If you argue that viruses are living things, and there is debate about that.
Creatures, yeah.
There is viral editing. We've been using bacteriophages to prevent or become antibiotics for people. So we are editing living things.
We're continuing our discussion of citizen science and trying not to get into the weeds, trying desperately not to get into the weeds with a lot of highly theoretical business. So let's talk about things that we could conceivably do now that would stay within the constraints that we described at the beginning of this talk. One of them, vat-grown meat operations, are already in existence. There's quite a few. A lot of the ones that are gaining ground in terms of combating existential risks associated with factory farming are actually not vat-grown meats, but rather let's say lab-grown meats for just for clarification, but are actually near meats, things that seem like meat, but taste like meat, but actually don't have. They're just very, very good facsimiles. That's a little bit different thing, and also an engineering marvel, and one that's improved since when I first became a vegan, but still not the same thing as our mad scientist discussion. So the lab-grown meat for more controversial meats, chiefly human beef, delicious, nutritious human beef. Why? What's wrong? I don't get it. Is this a taboo? I don't understand. Lab-grown meat, just in this, it's no more difficult to make lab-grown meat than lab-grown beef. So this could be $1 million commercial operation, making and selling lab-grown meat to people. That's the kind of thing that would be in our constraints now of being cheap enough to run at a mid or high range cost lab, and the technology existing now to do it with some extra additional $200,000 of research to identify those cell lines and stuff,
Sure.
and start working on it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. That's just a number. So what's wrong with me wanting to do a human meat? It's safe, right? Human meat's pretty safe. It's not like I'm going to get that human version of mad cow, like Coro or something, from eating it.
No.
Like,
Depends on what kind of beef it is.
it has to be really clean, but if it's like there's no risk, there's a lot less personal risks to eating lab-grown beef than there is to eating factory-grown beef.
That's true.
So you have to assume the same thing would be true if I just chomped a bite off of somebody versus screw it in the lab, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I
Don't chomp. Just for clarification, the Arizona Transhumanist Party does not endorse chomping a huge bite off of somebody's butt. Don't do that. But lab-grown human meat, I think it would be an interesting thing. It's been mentioned in a few science fiction works that I enjoy. There's a very, very, very small subplot in a Charlie Strauss book that I read. And Charlie Strauss, a great science fiction writer who's described a lot of potentially near-term technologies and digital technologies that humans might be kind of utilizing in a more robust way in a few years. There's a lot of people we could point to along those lines, but maybe that's another podcast. What about for reducing hunting of endangered species? There are some cultures that are rather preoccupied with eating pangolins,
Yes.
or certain kinds of mammals. I could grow that muscle tissue for these people. They're not necessarily even eating it for its deliciousness. They're eating it for its giving them some virility or super duper homeopathic, outcome, or just being exotic and weird. So I mean, I could see that as being the $1 million operation, making pangolin meat, selling it to these assholes who want to eat pangolin meat. But you also have to kind of like look at where they're coming from. Like that may not be a real sound market. They might not want to eat that. They might want the real thing. They want to kill the pangolins.
Right. Into extinction.
Right, to extinction. Yeah. Real nice guys. Stop doing that. What other kind of medical commercial applications would you see for vat-grown beef? Did you have any other? Do we have any other notes on that? I don't think we really do.
Well, it's
we were
more environment. We talked about it being environmentally friendly.
Yeah, that's the main
being an
point.
alternative.
Yeah,
More humane.
Yeah.
I mean, that's I think probably the biggest thing is like it's vegan and more humane.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to make a case for more humane to the average Joe. It's easier to make a case for it will prevent an existential risk. The destruction to our environment caused by factory farming. It's basically the number 2 thing after fossil fuels that's contributing to climate change and this constellation of concerns.
Yeah.
If we don't have these alternatives in play, what's most likely going to happen is that countries like China and India that are industrializing and have large populations, if they start consuming meat, which they are to the extent that Americans do, the American-style diet, then that will create a much more significant negative effect on the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to... this is a thing that seems to happen in history, where the sort of early adopters kind of get a free pass for having done, like, just, having no EPA for 100 years in the industrialized world. And then, now we have these new rules that says that it makes it kind of harder for other countries to join us, go through those growing pains of industrialization, because now we're kind of saying, hey, you can't do what we did. Anyway, moralism. Let's see. We should have talked about this when we were talking more about fertility medicine. My favorite thing that we should do, which is an alternate form of, what's it called? Parthenogenesis? An alternate form of cloning. Not parthenogenesis. What's parthenogenesis? I'm mixing up my notes here. What is this term for what we're talking? Okay, so basically there's been a breakthrough just within the last year where you can take stem cells. What?
Yeah, keep going.
You can take stem cells and convert them into gamete cells with the same genetic material as the stem cell donor. Mm-hmm. So then you can effectively create an opposite-sexed gamete of yourself and impregnate or fertilize, as the case may be.
In your bio bag.
In your bio bag. No, let's just say in me or in a host, whoever the volunteer is, almost anybody, not me. 50%, at least about 50% of the population, could potentially be having this sort of quasi-clone, which would there would be some risks associated with this. Not the same risks of cloning. Cloning has a different set of problems associated with it that are kind of some of them are made great strides to being solved in the last 2 years. So much so that people are saying that a clone, it's kind of is maybe as likely as a biobag as a thing in a country that doesn't regulate this sort of thing. But this would have a different set of concerns with basically, in a word, inbreeding. If you have any genetic concerns in your genetic profile at all, which everyone does, the likelihood of an outcome where you have a very sick person in this clone is high.
Yeah.
And that's not a great thing. But it's also the kind of thing that pre-implantation screening might be able to completely account for. This is a technology that's been around in fertility medicine for decades now, and it's gotten better to the point where we can really avoid almost all of that by. So this would be an in vitro baby.
Yeah, genetic counseling has been really beneficial for people that have concerns with recessive genes.
Yes,
So
it's a whole industry. It's not an industry that's necessarily covered by health insurance, sadly, which relates back to our discussion at the meeting about. We had a discussion about a healthcare sharing organization that members of the Arizona Transhumanist Party are working on. Something that would be a model for transhumanists and transhumanist rights. But that's also maybe a discussion for a little later. Let's finish talking about this the quasi clone. What other possibilities? Why is this a hard thing to do today? Okay. Should I say that?
Yes.
Okay.
No.
Stacy had a funny idea and didn't want to say it, so I'm going to say it, which is that I should clone myself in a bio bag in an artificial womb, so that I can eat myself. Is that basically for Labrador and
Pretty
me?
much.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I'm going to do it. You've convinced me of the wisdom.
Okay.
No, but this sort of thing is a somewhat serious-minded subject for transhumanists. That is, how do we get enough organs and replacement parts for ourselves to effectively engage in biological life extension? And one of those possibilities has always been discussed is a clone who's never a sentient living person.
Yeah, it's just a harvest.
A harvest body, who you would be getting maybe some organs and things from. That in reality, the big hurdle to super longevity may be the mind. So there's no cloning your own mind, of course.
Yeah.
There are any number of interventions that have occurred within the last few years that have allowed people to reverse plaques in the brain, reverse neurodegenerative conditions, starting to be able to heal these things. We sometimes talk about the uses of various cannabinoids. One particular kind of cannabinoid, one of the main cannabinoids.
Which is proprietary.
Oh yeah, but no, I mean THCA, or no, CBG. Getting into alphabet soup here.
Proprietary.
Okay, yeah, okay. We're not talking about proprietary stuff. We're talking about fun science fiction stuff. Sorry. But I did want to say that there is a cannabinoid that is known to reverse neurodegenerative conditions to some degree. That's not proprietary, that's common knowledge.
Okay, so we have actually, in a TED Talk recently, I can't remember the name of the doctor, but we have been able to print off kidneys on bubble or inkjets, modified inkjets, but in the course of this presentation, he was able to print off a kidney. So we are getting to the point where we can do things like vasculature. I don't know where we are with neural networks and brain activity, but definitely with things like
well, not very
kidneys.
far. I mean, neural networks is a computing term, but I think I take your meaning.
Yeah.
There's
but connecting your brain to a computer.
Oh yeah, well that's another talk, and one that we will do about Neuralace and related technologies that are brain-computer interfaces that are becoming more and more a reality. Also a thing that I talked to people about 10 years ago, and they said, shut up, that's 100 years away, and they were wrong, and I was right.
Well, what I was going to say is we're using things like spinach leaves to create artificial hearts,
Mm.
which aren't necessarily artificial, but they are starting to do things like that, and even printable designs. So we're getting really high tech and advanced in those areas, and I imagine things like livers and such will be the next big thing that we're working to be able to print, because
and also because
donors are
circumventing the need for other kinds of donor organs, and certainly circumventing the need for any person with the resources to harvest a clone of themselves. But the sort of grotesqueness of harvesting a clone of yourself is also a major market hurdle, aside from just having other things in the wings that would replace it. There's no shortage of breakthroughs in terms of recreating all sorts of human parts, and this is an area that people have been interested in, basically, to some degree and another for the better part of a century. So what do we think about? Well, maybe we're running out of stuff to talk about. I don't know. Okay, I have a link here. This was so there was a movie with the actor from Avatar, Sam Worthington. That movie was called The Titan on Netflix. Did you ever watch that?
No.
Did you try and watch that? I watched half of it, and I decided that it was kind of dumb. But but as a concept, it was a great idea, and I'm thankful for Netflix for having made this brave film. But the script kind of fell apart. I can be a snob about that stuff, but it was basically about genetically engineering humans to exist in extreme situations, extremophile humans living on Mars. And the extremophile human, played by Sam Worthington, spoiler alert, goes apeshit and does bad stuff, I think. I didn't watch the very end. We'll forget about people going apeshit, but what about cloning Supermen in space for life on Mars? Do you think it's a good idea?
I think that if we do stuff like that, we need to be prepared to expect that in the near future they will not be what we would consider human. It'd be another race.
Transhuman, if you will.
It would be another race, and we wouldn't be able to crossbreed anymore.
Yes.
So as long as we're prepared for that, and
well, that creates maybe a set of compatibility and microbial compatibility issues. If you introduce this bunch of microbes to a really strange environment for some cycles of their lifespans, they might be so changed as to become a species that would be risky for other species to be around. So there's certainly good reasons for the Sam Worthington not to come back to Earth. But what about the reasons for Sam Worthington to have never been born in the first place?
Anytime a scientist creates something like that, they always have to ask themselves, what would be the impact? And I think it's always something that makes us a little fearful, is knowing or understanding that what you create may cause a huge disruption to the environment at great cost.
Yes, and that's a real risk. I suppose the Mars environment is a little hard to understand the risk there, but we definitely want to be extremely circumspect when it comes to these things in the Earth environment. An argument against bioremediation, something we've talked about a lot, and I would like to talk about more. But I want to make a point about about Sam Worthington. Is Sam Worthington a result of gene therapy, or is Sam Worthington, a result of germline changes to the gene line to the DNA at birth.
Well, I would imagine that if you wanted these changes to be permanent, it would need to be germline.
Yeah, this makes more sense from a research perspective if those are germline changes.
Yeah,
in the movie, he's just a normal guy, and then he's gene therapy, and now he's whatever, The Fly or something.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking is The Fly. But,
yeah, that's a great movie.
Yeah. My
both of those are good.
My
movies.
concern in the saying, what impact would it have would definitely be towards Earth, but we also have kind of a responsibility. If we go to other planets, we have to be very careful about how we introduce new or any life to that environment.
Okay.
One of NASA's huge concerns is always to make sure that whatever goes into space,
the law of unintended consequences.
is as clean as possible.
Yes, because there are legitimate contamination issues in this world. It's a little hard to think of a huge concern for contamination on Mars, being so distant. But you can imagine the same set of concerns. I just interviewed a gentleman named Nikolai Agapov, about his plan for an orbital ring, a space elevator. And you can imagine that lab, if such a thing were constructed, which could quite reasonably be constructed in the near future. If such a thing were constructed, you would have to worry a little bit more about that on the moon than you do now. Okay, let's talk about creatures. You said there were creatures that you'd like to see. What's your? I think almost everybody I've ever met has had some kind of dream about a tiny, tiny, tiny horse, or a really, really, really big mouse that was their friend or something. Everybody's had that dream. I've had 100 of those dreams. Tell us your dreams of creatures that you want to make.
Oh, I would love to have a pygmy elephant, by far. The
Okay.
best thing ever.
Okay. Yeah, and that's something that there's a sort of good genetic precedent for that in evolutionary biology. Like, it's kind of the easiest thing to control for. Over time, if you put a creature on an island and it has a lot of food, it gets bigger. If you put a big creature on an island and it has not enough food, it gets smaller in pretty short order. So there's evolutionary histories there, genetic histories in a lot of creatures that might allow for an easier understanding of those things. And some of those things have been isolated in reality now for making things smaller.
I mean, maybe in birds' beak sizes and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, I mean those,
like
but some of the genetic markers for size of creatures is a little better understood than it was a few years ago.
So
there have been breakthroughs in that area.
Yeah. Even within humans, like nutrition has gotten better, so we've increased in height. So,
yeah, and that sort of thing as well. There's a lot of ways to control for that. I mean, definitely bringing back a lot of extinct or certainly endangered tropical plants or insects. These are now areas where you're not just talking about a fun thing, but maybe a worthwhile undertaking. Not that building a theme park with a bunch of what are those fluffy elephants called?
Woolly mammoths.
Woolly mammoths. Not that building a theme park with a bunch of woolly mammoths isn't kind of worthwhile, I guess, but certainly restoring lost tropical plants, lost insects, other creatures, ocean life, and other cute creatures just because they're cute. Why not? That's the reason that people usually think of this stuff. That's not necessarily the reason that scientists usually think of this stuff, but
I think
there's something to be said for just doing something fun.
Yeah, I mean, it would be awesome to have like a gene bank of every living organism that we have.
Well, there is that. It's just not super great. There was one in the Arctic. There's the Ark, but
Right.
but
But it
it,
doesn't
it kind of
have
thawed
really-
out a few years ago because of some melting ice caps. The arc was damaged. Horrible thing. But it doesn't. But you were talking about it's in how to do that better.
Well, yeah, and we're actually in a process of going into like a mass extinction, so it'd be.
That certainly seems to be the case. There's no denying that these prospects are very real, just as there's no denying that climate change is having an effect on human populations and economies and nation states. These die-offs, particularly as it relates to perhaps ocean life, are very upsetting. But very upsetting in any of these contexts.
As a transhumanist, I would think that it would be critical to ensure that you have a world worth living in.
Aesthetically, as well.
Yeah, maybe not just aesthetically, but being able to breathe the air and
Yes.
having a healthy environment.
Having not living with ecocide, and having a kind of lifestyle that's palatable for not just the billions of human beings who decide to go live in bunkers underground, but palatable for ecological systems as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
because
that's
we are part of an ecological system.
yes, yeah. And I mean, it's one area where maybe transhumanists may, as a class, tend to diverge from other people, is the degree to which we need to be tied in some way. Many transhumanists might refer to this concern as more of an aesthetic concern. I don't. I mean, maybe not aesthetic, but a moralist concern rather than a practical concern. But it is indeed a practical concern as much as anything, because we don't have the infrastructure currently to all go live in, all get on Elon Musk's rocket and go to Mars. Elon Musk's spending a lot of money for Elon Musk's rocket to Mars. He hasn't built my rocket to Mars yet. I have to fend for myself here with the ecological collapse. All right, so this concludes our discussion of mad science. We'll have another science discussion with citizen science themes that we didn't get to today, a little bit more at a later date. Thank you again, Stace NG, for giving us some insights. And I'm sorry I got a little close to the line with proprietary information. I can edit that out. Thanks again, and
Thank you.
And we'll talk to you soon. Hopefully, we'll see you on Tuesday at the meeting.
I have one more thing I want to ask you.
Please
Okay. It's kind of a ridiculous question.
go.
So if you were able to edit yourself to do anything, like a gene editing, and we did have that kind of technology,
Yeah.
what would be 2 or 3 things that you would definitely want to edit in yourself?
Well, I'm actually pretty conservative on some of this stuff because I don't want to do anything that's too harmful. I'm not going to get too many elective surgeries just because I think they would be neat. I don't have tattoos because they mess with your lymph node system. That's not too great. I don't. There's a lot of things that I try to do lifestyle wise. I intermittently fast and avoid certain things. We'll talk about some of these concepts again. So mostly the things that I would want to do would be things that are completely safe and have been thoroughly modeled and tested on other creatures besides myself. Anthony, the vice chair and frequent collaborator of this organization, and I have talked about respirosites, things that are going to give humans a great deal of physical strength and other capacities. I would definitely be open to those things, but I would just want to see that they've been thoroughly modeled.
Okay, well that's a given that we'd want anything we do to be tested.
Well, yeah.
No.
It's a given, but it's not a foregone conclusion which of those things will happen first or at all. You want to hear something grotesque, right?
Sure, why not? Yes.
Okay.
Here's something grotesque.
Okay, well, let's not say grotesque. Let's rather describe an otherly abled person. Let's say a person with an unfortunate with a sort of a condition like a thalidomide baby, a quadriplegic with severe disfigurement. Such a person could have all sorts of engineering marvels attached to themselves, or could simply just be flying around in a drone like a little Mad Max kind of character. I can see at a certain point in this development, normally abled people, so to speak, opting to do some of these things. This is a controversial thing. Many people who are not transhumanists fear and loathe transhumanists for wanting to do some of this stuff. But I could definitely see doing some of that at a certain point in the future. But that also is subject to its healthful effects. What about yourself? You don't have any.
Night vision and increased intelligence.
Oh yes. Well, I guess I didn't. I'm not smart, so I didn't think of increased intelligence. But that's something that most transhumanists want. Something that guys like Ray Kurzweil have written about a lot, and that's definitely pretty high on my list. And there's all manner of ways in which something like Neuralace is effectively an increase in intelligence maximizer, even though it's not literally going in and supercharging your neurons. Yeah.
And I would sacrifice color vision in order to have night vision. I think that would be really cool.
Okay, yeah. You can also imagine, there's also these things that are not quite entirely speculative about other forms of vision beyond color and beyond the visible spectrum. Those things there have been, I won't say it's great breakthroughs, but there's been a little bit more understanding of how that would play out as an alteration. That's great. Is there anything else you want to say to the mad scientists out there?
Be weird.
Be weird. Break the law? No, don't break the law. Move to China. If you don't want to be in the country that gets left behind, then you got to move.
Be weird and dream big. That's what I'd say.
Okay, excellent. Thank you again, Stace. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.